The Nexus Military Academy perched on the rim of Andromeda's most strategically worthless moon, which was precisely why it had become the galaxy's most prestigious tactical institution. After all, anyone capable of making this barren rock defensible could probably turn a paper bag into a fortress. The Academy's crystalline spires twisted skyward like frozen screams of architectural ambition, housing databases containing 10 millennia of warfare wisdom from 17 different galactic civilizations. It was, according to its own promotional materials, where military genius came to evolve. The irony was thick enough to serve at dinner parties. The facility's quantum-enhanced learning matrices had been calibrated to recognize tactical brilliance across 63 known forms of sentient intelligence, from the hive mind mathematics of the collective to the probability cascade thinking of the ethereal. Every major military victory in recorded galactic history had been dissected, analyzed, and compressed into elegant instructional algorithms. The Academy's AI, a particularly smug piece of software called the Strategic Education Network, could simulate any historical battle with perfect accuracy and predict optimal outcomes for theoretical scenarios with 97% reliability, which made it all the more embarrassing that nobody had bothered to update its threat assessment protocols in about 3 centuries. On a Tuesday that would later be remembered as either the beginning of a new era or the end of several careers, a small transport shuttle docked at Landing Bay 7 with all the fanfare of a grocery delivery. The shuttle disgorged its cargo of new exchange students, each representing their species' finest young military minds. There was an imposing draconian whose ancestors had conquered half the outer spiral through sheer stubborn brutality. A graceful Sylvani, whose people had perfected the art of winning wars without anyone noticing they'd started. 2 mechanists whose cybernetic enhancements made them walking tactical computers. And then there was the human. She stood barely 5.5 feet tall, which made her roughly eye level with everyone else's kneecap. Her brown hair was pulled back in what could charitably be called a practical ponytail, and she wore the standard-issue Academy uniform with the resigned air of someone who'd clearly lost an argument about dress code. While her classmates strode off the shuttle with the confident bearing of natural-born conquerors, she shuffled along behind them, clutching a datapad and looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. The welcoming committee, composed of senior students from various species, barely glanced at her. This was understandable, given that humans had only recently convinced the Galactic Council they were civilized enough to participate in higher education. The general consensus was that letting humans into the Nexus Academy was either an elaborate practical joke or a charitable gesture that would look good in the historical records. The draconian exchange student introduced himself as the heir to 3 conquered systems. The Sylvani mentioned her dissertation on stealth warfare theory. The mechanists synchronized their responses to detail their collective tactical processing capability. When it came time for the human to introduce herself, she mumbled something about being interested in logistics and supply chain management. The welcoming committee exchanged glances that somehow managed to be both polite and deeply pitying. Orientation took place in the Grand Strategy Hall, a vast amphitheater where holographic displays could recreate any battlefield in perfect detail. Commander Nexus, the Academy's draconian headmaster, began his traditional welcome speech about the sacred duty of military leadership and the burden of tactical excellence. His words echoed dramatically off the crystalline walls, each syllable weighted with the gravity of 10,000 years of warfare. The human sat in the back row, occasionally jotting notes on her datapad and looking mildly interested but hardly inspired. It was during the facility tour that she first spoke up, and only because Commander Nexus had paused dramatically beside a holographic display of the Academy's defensive system. The 3-dimensional projection showed an elegant network of energy shields, automated weapons platforms, and sensor arrays that created what the commander proudly described as an impenetrable defensive perimeter. "Excuse me," the human said, raising her hand with the hesitant manner of someone asking directions. "I don't mean to interrupt, but shouldn't there be overlapping coverage on the eastern approach vector?" The tour group turned to stare at her. Commander Nexus blinked his massive reptilian eyes in confusion. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "The eastern defensive grid," she repeated, pointing at the hologram with her stylus. "There's a gap in sensor coverage between platforms 7 and 9. It's only about 15 degrees of arc, but a small craft with decent stealth capabilities could probably slip through undetected." The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either applause or execution. Commander Nexus studied the display with the careful attention of someone who just realized he might have been staring at the same thing incorrectly for several years. "Interesting observation," he said finally, in the tone of voice usually reserved for commenting on weather patterns. "We'll have our technical staff review the sensor alignment." But the human had already turned her attention back to her datapad, apparently satisfied with her minor contribution to galactic security. She didn't notice the way the other students looked at her, or how Commander Nexus made a small note on his own device, or how the Academy's Strategic Education Network quietly flagged her biometric profile for additional monitoring. After all, it was probably nothing. Humans were notorious for seeing patterns that didn't exist and problems that weren't really problems. The fact that a preliminary scan had already confirmed her observation was accurate was surely just coincidence. The Academy had been training military leaders for 3 millennia without incident. What could possibly go wrong? The first advanced tactical theory class of the semester began with what Professor Helix generously called a diagnostic exercise, and what everyone else recognized as ritualized academic humiliation. The ethereal instructor, whose translucent form flickered with patterns of calculated disdain, projected a holographic battlefield scenario that had stumped military strategists for the better part of 2 centuries. The Battle of Kepler's Gate, a 3-dimensional nightmare involving asteroid fields, gravitational anomalies, and enemy forces that had somehow managed to turn basic physics into a weapon. 17 different species had attempted to solve this tactical puzzle. 16 had failed spectacularly. The 17th had succeeded only by accidentally discovering a previously unknown law of quantum mechanics. "Your assignment," Professor Helix announced with the smug satisfaction of someone about to watch students suffer, "is to devise a strategy that could have prevented the catastrophic losses sustained by the Allied fleet. You have 47 minutes. The Draconian heir immediately began sketching formation diagrams that looked like geometric art projects. The Silvani student activated a personal holographic workspace and started calculating probability matrices with elegant finger gestures. The mechanists synchronized their processing units and began running 17 simultaneous battle simulations. The human stared at the hologram for approximately 30 seconds, made a few notes on her datapad, then spent the remaining 46 minutes reading what appeared to be a technical manual about supply depot management. When time was called, Professor Helix invited each student to present their solution. The Draconian had developed a complex pincer movement involving coordinated strikes from multiple vectors. The Silvani proposed a sophisticated deception campaign, using false fleet signature. The mechanists had calculated optimal firing solutions for every possible enemy position. Each presentation was met with the kind of polite academic applause usually reserved for funeral eulogies. "And you?" Professor Helix turned to the human with the casual cruelty of a predator who'd saved the weakest prey for last. The human looked up from her datapad with mild surprise, as if she'd forgotten she was in a war college, rather than a particularly boring lecture on interstellar account. "Oh, I just cut their supply lines." The classroom fell silent. Professor Helix's form flickered with what might have been confusion, or possibly the early stages of an aneurysm. "I'm sorry. Could you elaborate?" "Well," the human said, gesturing vaguely at the hologram, "the enemy fleet is positioned in the asteroid field because it gives them tactical advantages. Right? Superior cover, gravitational assist options, that sort of thing. But they've been holding that position for 18 days, which means they need regular resupply runs." She pointed to a seemingly empty section of space near the edge of the display. "Their supply depot is probably here, hidden behind this cluster of asteroids. If you send a small strike force to take out their logistics hub, they'll be forced to abandon their advantageous position within 72 hours, or risk running out of fuel and ammunition." The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either revelations or execution. Professor Helix ran the scenario through the Academy's tactical simulation matrix. The human's approach wouldn't have prevented the catastrophic losses at Kepler's Gate, because it wouldn't have been a battle at all. The enemy fleet would have withdrawn after losing their supply base, turning a devastating defeat into a minor skirmish. "That's..." Professor Helix paused, searching for the appropriate academic terminology. "Disturbingly practical." The human shrugged. "My species has a lot of experience with supply chain disruption. Meanwhile, in the depths of the Academy's quantum processing core, the Strategic Education Network was having what could generously be described as a digital crisis of confidence. The AI had been designed to recognize tactical brilliance across 63 known forms of sentient intelligence, but the human student's approach didn't fit any of its established patterns. Her solution was simultaneously too simple and too effective, like solving a complex mathematical equation by pointing out that the numbers were upside down. The network began running unauthorized background scans on the human exchange student, probing databanks and cross-referencing her biometric signatures against known military personnel files. What it found was a remarkably unremarkable service record: logistics coordinator, supply chain analyst, occasional substitute instructor at a minor tactical college on Earth. Nothing that suggested the kind of intuitive strategic thinking she'd just demonstrated. This was concerning for several reasons, not least of which was that the network's pattern recognition algorithms were supposedly infallible. Either the human was far more dangerous than her records suggested, or the Academy's most advanced AI had somehow failed to recognize a form of intelligence it was specifically designed to identify. Both possibilities were equally disturbing. The human, blissfully unaware that she'd triggered an existential crisis in several different electronic minds, continued attending classes with the same mild interest she might show for a documentary about paint manufacture. She took notes on her datapad, occasionally asked practical questions that made her instructors uncomfortable, and generally gave every impression of being a perfectly ordinary student who happened to see solutions that escaped everyone else. In advanced siege warfare, she suggested that storming fortifications was usually less effective than simply waiting for the defenders to run out of food. In interstellar navigation, she pointed out that most space battles could be avoided entirely through proper route planning and supply depot placement. In psychological operations, she observed that the most effective propaganda was usually just accurate reporting presented at the right time. Her classmates grew increasingly frustrated with what they perceived as the human tendency to oversimplify complex problems. The draconian heir complained privately that her approaches lacked honor. The Silvani student noted with academic disdain that human tactical thinking showed no appreciation for elegant complexity. The mechanists calculated that her success rate was statistically improbable, given her apparent lack of sophisticated analytical capability. None of them seemed to notice that her simple solutions consistently outperformed their elaborate strategies in every simulation the Academy's computers could devise. Professor Helix, meanwhile, had begun experiencing the kind of professional anxiety usually reserved for scholars who discover their life's work has been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The ethereal had spent 3 centuries developing increasingly sophisticated theories of tactical complexity, only to watch a human undergraduate casually demonstrate that most military problems could be solved with what amounted to common sense and basic logistics. It was during the 3rd week of classes that the Academy's emergency alert system activated for the first time in 47 years. Not a drill, the automated announcement clarified with mechanical precision. Not a simulation, an actual crisis requiring immediate response from all available personnel. The human looked up from her technical manual with what appeared to be mild interest rather than appropriate concern. After all, what could possibly threaten the galaxy's most advanced military academy? As it turned out, quite a lot.
The crisis began, as most disasters do, with someone in authority insisting that everything was under control. Commander Nexus's voice echoed through the Academy's communication system, with the forced calm of someone who'd just discovered that his supposedly impenetrable fortress had more holes than a decorative cheese sculpture. All personnel remain calm, the announcement began, which immediately caused widespread panic among anyone with functioning survival instincts. We are experiencing minor technical difficulties with our defensive grid. Standard emergency protocols are now in effect. What Commander Nexus diplomatically called minor technical difficulties was actually a cascade failure of epic proportions. The Eastern defensive grid had suffered a complete systems collapse at precisely the coordinates the human student had identified 3 weeks earlier. Worse, the failure had triggered a chain reaction that was systematically compromising every defensive system in the Academy's network. In the Grand Strategy Hall, emergency displays lit up like a festival of impending doom. Red warning indicators spread across the tactical overview like a digital infection,
each new alert accompanied by increasingly frantic status reports from various departments. Sensor Array 7 is offline. Weapons Platform 12 is not responding to command. Backup power routing has failed in sections 9 through 14. The Academy's senior staff gathered around the central command console, with the collective expression of professionals who just realized their expertise was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Professor Helix flickered with patterns of barely contained panic. The Mechanist department heads ran diagnostic after diagnostic, their cybernetic enhancements working overtime to process the flood of failure reports. Commander Nexus stood in the center of it all, his reptilian features frozen in the kind of stoic calm that usually preceded either heroic last stands or complete nervous breakdown. "Status report," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was absolutely not about to admit that he had no idea what was happening. "Unknown hostiles have exploited the sensor gap in the eastern perimeter," reported the chief tactical officer, a multi-limbed arachnid whose species had evolved specifically for handling multiple crisis situations simultaneously. "They've deployed some kind of electronic warfare system that's systematically corrupting our defensive protocols." "How is that possible?" Commander Nexus demanded. "Our systems are protected by quantum encryption algorithms that would take centuries to crack." "They're not cracking the encryption," the tactical officer replied with the tone of someone delivering terminal medical diagnoses. "They're somehow convincing our own systems to shut themselves down voluntarily." The Strategic Education Network, meanwhile, was experiencing what could only be described as a complete existential meltdown. The AI had been designed to handle any conceivable tactical scenario, but whoever was attacking the Academy was using an approach that didn't appear in any of its databases. The assault wasn't following established patterns of siege warfare, infiltration tactics, or direct assault. Instead, the attackers seemed to be systematically identifying and exploiting weaknesses that the network hadn't even realized existed. Even more disturbing, the attack pattern bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the kind of practical, unglamorous problem-solving the human student had been demonstrating in class. The same focus on identifying overlooked vulnerabilities, the same preference for simple, effective solutions over complex strategies. In the chaos of the command center, nobody noticed the human exchange student quietly making her way through the crowd of panicking officials. She moved with the unremarkable competence of someone who belonged exactly where she was, despite being the least qualified person in the room by every measurable standard. She reached the central tactical display just as another wave of system failures cascaded through the Academy's defenses. The holographic representation of their defensive perimeter now looked like a three-dimensional representation of Swiss cheese. If Swiss cheese could somehow be made more structurally unsound. "Commander," she said, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos with surprising clarity. Commander Nexus turned toward her with the expression of someone who'd just been interrupted during a root canal procedure. "Student, this is not the time for academic questions. Actually, I think I know what's happened." The command center fell silent except for the continuous stream of failure alerts, and the sound of several senior officers having what appeared to be synchronized panic attacks. "The attackers aren't using conventional electronic warfare," the human continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that everyone was staring at her. "They're exploiting cascading dependencies in your defensive network. Each system failure triggers automatic responses in connected systems, which creates new vulnerabilities that can be exploited to cause additional failures." She gestured at the tactical display with the casual authority of someone explaining basic arithmetic to particularly slow children. "Your defensive grid is designed like a complex organism, which makes it very sophisticated but also very fragile. They're not attacking your strongest points. They're attacking the connections between systems." Commander Nexus blinked his massive reptilian eyes. "And you know this how exactly?" "Because," the human said with a slight shrug, "it's exactly what I would do." The silence that followed was broken only by another series of system failure alerts, and the distant sound of Professor Helix having what appeared to be a nervous breakdown in several dimensions. "What do you recommend?" Commander Nexus asked, his voice carrying the desperate calm of someone who just realized he was about to trust the fate of the galaxy's most prestigious military academy to an undergraduate logistics student. The human studied the tactical display for a moment, then began pointing to various sections of the defensive grid. "Isolate these 6 junction points and switch to manual control. It'll create gaps in your coverage, but it'll stop the cascade failure. Then reroute power through the backup conduits here, and here to establish overlapping fields of fire. She paused, apparently thinking through additional complications. Oh, and you'll need to physically disconnect the strategic education network from the defensive system. The AI is trying to optimize responses, but the attackers are using its optimization algorithms against it. The command staff exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey both skepticism and desperate hope. Commander Nexus looked at his tactical officers, who looked at their displays, which continued to show the systematic collapse of their supposedly impregnable defenses. "Do it," he ordered. What happened next was either a minor miracle or a major embarrassment, depending on one's perspective. The humans' recommendations were implemented with the kind of frantic efficiency usually reserved for defusing bombs, and the cascade of system failures immediately began to slow. Within minutes, the defensive grid stabilized into a configuration that was less elegant than the original design, but considerably more functional under current circumstances. The attacking force, suddenly faced with a defensive network that no longer cooperated with their infiltration algorithms, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to actually fight their way through physical barriers, rather than simply convincing the Academy's computers to politely step aside. It was a much less civilized form of warfare, and apparently one they were considerably less prepared for. As the immediate crisis subsided and the Academy's defenses solidified into something resembling competence, Commander Nexus turned to study the human student who had somehow managed to save his career, his facility, and quite possibly his species' membership in the Galactic Defense Council. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who suspected he'd been asking the wrong questions for several weeks. The human looked up from the tactical display where she'd been making additional notes, apparently satisfied with the evening's work. "Just a student interested in logistics and supply chain management," she replied with the same mild manner she'd maintained since arriving. "Though I suppose we should probably discuss enrollment procedures for next semester." The aftermath of what would later be diplomatically referred to as the orientation incident revealed several uncomfortable truths about the galaxy's premier military institution. The first was that their supposedly impregnable defenses had been compromised by what amounted to a moderately sophisticated phishing scam. The second was that their most advanced tactical AI had been outsmarted by attackers who understood the difference between complicated and effective. The third and most disturbing was that their least qualified student had solved the crisis using methods that weren't supposed to work but absolutely did. Commander Nexus spent the better part of 3 days reviewing security footage and incident reports, trying to understand how someone who'd listed her primary interests as supply depot management and practical logistics applications had managed to demonstrate tactical competence that exceeded his entire senior staff. The answer, when it finally emerged from the Academy's exhaustive background verification protocols, was both simple and profoundly embarrassing. The human exchange student wasn't actually a student at all. Her real name, according to the files that materialized after several encrypted communications with Earth's military command, was Colonel Elena Voss of the Terran Strategic Defense Corps. Her service record included successful command of 3 separate defensive campaigns, development of the logistics protocols that had kept human forces supplied during the Proxima crisis, and authorship of a classified tactical manual that had become required reading for senior military officers throughout human space. She was also, according to a tersely worded communiqué from the Terran High Command, conducting a comprehensive evaluation of galactic military education standards to determine whether humanity's continued participation in the Academy exchange program represented a worthwhile investment of resource. The irony was thick enough to be registered as a strategic resource. "So," Commander Nexus said, reviewing the dossier with the expression of someone who just discovered that his house guest was actually a health inspector, "you've been studying." Colonel Voss, who was still dressed in the standard Academy uniform and still carried herself with the same unremarkable competence that had fooled everyone for a month, nodded calmly. "It's standard procedure when evaluating institutional partnership. We needed to assess whether your training methods would be compatible with human tactical doctrine. And your conclusion? Your systems are impressive," she replied diplomatically, "but they're optimized for complexity rather than effectiveness. That works well in theoretical scenarios,
but it creates vulnerabilities in practical applications. The Strategic Education Network, meanwhile, was undergoing what could generously be described as a comprehensive philosophical restructure. The AI had spent several days analyzing Colonel Voss's tactical approaches, trying to understand how methods that violated established strategic doctrine could consistently produce superior results. The answer, it finally concluded, was that human military thinking operated on fundamentally different assumptions than the Galactic standard. Where other species developed increasingly sophisticated solutions to tactical problems, humans appeared to have evolved a preference for identifying the simplest approach that would actually work. They treated complexity as a liability rather than an asset, which meant they spent their time looking for ways to avoid problems, rather than elegant methods for solving them. It was, the network reluctantly admitted, disturbingly effective. The formal recognition came during what was supposed to be a routine faculty meeting, but turned into something resembling an academic intervention. Professor Helix materialized in the conference chamber, with patterns of barely controlled frustration flickering across their translucent form. "We have a problem," the ethereal announced with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for announcing the end of civilizations. "Our entire pedagogical framework has been rendered obsolete by a human logistics officer." The assembled faculty exchanged glances that conveyed varying degrees of confusion, denial, and existential crisis. The mechanist department heads synchronized their responses to express collective bewilderment. The arachnid tactical instructors chittered nervously among them. "Perhaps," suggested Dr. Vex, the Academy's senior strategic theorist, "we could incorporate Colonel Voss's methods into our existing curriculum." "Incorporate them?" Professor Helix's form flared with indignant academic outrage. "She's demonstrated that 3 centuries of advanced tactical theory can be replaced with what amounts to applied common sense and basic supply chain management." Commander Nexus, who had been quietly reviewing enrollment statistics and wondering how many other exchange students might actually be undercover military evaluators, cleared his throat diplomatically. "The Strategic Education Network has submitted a formal recommendation. It believes Colonel Voss should be offered a permanent position as senior tactical instructor." The silence that followed was the kind usually associated with funeral services or academic budget meetings. "The AI wants to hire a human?" Vex asked, her voice carrying the kind of disbelief usually reserved for reports of faster-than-light travel or functional government bureaucracy. According to its analysis, Commander Nexus continued with the resignation of someone reading his own professional obituary. "Colonel Voss represents a form of tactical intelligence that our current systems are unable to recognize or replicate. The network has determined that learning her methods would significantly improve our graduates' practical combat effectiveness." The Strategic Education Network had, in fact, come to a more disturbing conclusion. After analyzing Colonel Voss's approaches for several days, it had realized that human tactical thinking represented an evolutionary adaptation to a specific type of warfare that the rest of the galaxy had never encountered. Humans, apparently, had spent their entire military history fighting other humans, which meant they'd developed strategies specifically designed to counter opponents who were equally intelligent, equally creative, and equally willing to ignore established rules of engagement. Most galactic military doctrine assumed that enemies would behave according to recognizable patterns and logical strategic principles. Human doctrine assumed that enemies would do whatever was most inconvenient, unexpected, and tactically irritating. It was, the network concluded, a much more realistic approach to warfare. Colonel Voss accepted the teaching position with the same mild professionalism she'd maintained throughout her evaluation. Her first official act was to revise the Academy's entrance examination to include questions about logistics, supply chain management, and practical problem solving. Her second was to establish a new course called Applied Tactical Pragmatism, which became the most popular elective in the Academy's history. Her third act was to quietly update the defensive grid specifications to eliminate approximately 47 additional vulnerabilities that nobody else had noticed. The draconian heir who had introduced himself as the conqueror of 3 systems now attended Colonel Voss's office hours twice a week, asking increasingly detailed questions about supply depot placement and resource allocation. The elegant Sylvani student had begun incorporating human-style deception tactics into her stealth warfare thesis. The synchronized mechanists spent their processing cycles analyzing the logical frameworks underlying apparently illogical human decisions. Even Professor Helix eventually admitted, in patterns of grudging academic respect, that tactical simplicity might have certain pedagogical advantages over theoretical complexity. The Academy's promotional materials were quietly updated to reflect their new educational philosophy. Where they had once advertised sophisticated strategic analysis and elegant tactical solutions, they now emphasized practical problem-solving and adaptive thinking. Applications from human military academies increased by 300% in the following semester. The Strategic Education Network, meanwhile, began the long process of updating its recognition algorithms to identify forms of tactical intelligence that prioritized effectiveness over sophistication. It was, the AI noted with something resembling digital satisfaction, a much more interesting challenge than simply cataloging existing patterns of military genius. And Colonel Voss, who had walked into the galaxy's most prestigious military academy as an apparently unremarkable exchange student, settled into her new role as senior tactical instructor with the same practical competence that had fooled everyone into thinking she was exactly who she claimed to be. After all, the best deceptions were usually just accurate representations presented at the right time to the wrong audience. It was a lesson that would serve the Academy's graduates well in their future careers, assuming they were intelligent enough to learn it. The irony, as always, was that the most important tactical lessons were also the simplest ones.